Hey guys, Epidemic 2020 here. All right, the question, is belief in God properly basic? My answer is no. I think that's actually just a mistaken idea, and I'm going to explain why in a moment. All right, so a little bit of background information. People that answer yes to that question, that think God's existence is properly basic, they're called, it's a category called Reformed epistemology. And it's an awfully named category because most of the philosophers, or at least a huge chunk of them that end up being Reformed epistemologists, aren't actually Reformed. So really bad title, but leaving that aside, the general concept is there are some beliefs that are basic, which means they don't rely on evidence or argument. And that there might also be some beliefs that are properly basic, that are rational to believe, even if you lack evidence or argument for it. So evidence and argument are not required. Or another way of saying it, no inferences are needed. Now, if you're like me, that originally sounds crazy. Like, how could you believe something without evidence or argument? Now, the best way to understand properly basic beliefs are to give some examples. All right, so let's try it. Let's say you have a really sharp pain in your back, a stabbing pain. And you look around, you don't find any verifying evidence for it. Right? There's no wound. You go to the doctor, the MRI checks out, they can find nothing wrong with you. Even if there's no evidence to suggest that your back hurts, you have rational reason to believe that your back hurts. You didn't need any further evidence to prove what was already super obvious to you. You felt the pain directly, no further evidence required. Now, you could still have further evidence of this. Right? Let's say your back hurts, you turn around and there's a knife sticking out of your back. It's going to be very easy to convince other people you're not lying. You can be like, my back definitely hurts. Look, there's a knife sticking out of it. Right? So you can verify with evidence that your back hurts, but you didn't need any of that evidence because long before you verified the knife exists, you already knew that your back hurt. So your back hurting is not something that requires evidence to be rationally believed. So it is properly basic. Now, just as a side note, almost all the philosophers that end up arguing that God's existence is properly basic, meaning doesn't require evidence or inference or arguments, end up believing also that evidence, inference, and arguments for God's existence are overwhelming, and there's a lot of evidence to be had. So this is not, for most people, just an attempt to avoid presenting any evidence for God's existence. They think that evidence exists, but that it wasn't actually required. So for example, grandma who believes in God doesn't have to give you some philosophically researched argument or something like that. She already has reasonable belief, even if she can't articulate it. That's the concept. But most of them, just for the record, do believe the evidence is out there. All right, one more example of a properly basic belief. I'm going to steal this analogy from a philosopher named Chris Tucker. He says, when I look outside and see a tree, it means nothing to me. But when an arborist or a landscaper looks outside and sees a tree, he might be like, that's a hickory tree. He immediately recognizes the tree. His vision is reliable, but he doesn't have any argument as to why it's a hickory tree. Like he's not counting the leaves and being like, oh, 17 leaves per actual leaf. That must be a hickory tree. Or saying the leaves have serrated edges or that the bark is all running vertically. Like you don't have to actually know. He doesn't have to know what it is that makes it a hickory tree in order for him to recognize that it is in fact a hickory tree. So it doesn't, even if he's not aware of the evidence that makes his claim true, he's still able to have this rational belief that it is in fact a hickory tree. So that's an example of a basic belief. A belief that's rational doesn't depend on the evidence, though. All right, so keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to that one. The philosopher that came up with this idea that belief in God is properly basic is Alvin Plantinga. So we're going to start with him as an example. Now, historical side note, he actually thinks that the first person to do this that he's aware of is Calvin, right, who's famous for reformed thinking. So that's why he names this philosophy Reformed epistemology, something he credits Calvin for coming up with, but that you don't have to believe anything that Calvin said, basically, in order to fit into the camp Reformed epistemology. All right, long story short, the reason he thinks that God's existence is basic is because he thinks that we have another sense, very similar to our sense of sight or sense of taste, called the sensus divinitatus. And this allows us to directly apprehend that God exists. And you can kind of skip some steps there. You don't actually require further evidence because just like your back hurts is super obvious to you, well, belief in God may be similarly obvious. So I made a little drawing here to help us out. Let's take a look. All right. So anytime you come across something in nature that seems amazing or gives you this sense of awe, like looking at the stars in the night sky, and you think, wow, this is amazing. You could use your sensus divinitatis to conclude that God exists. It leads you to belief in God. He advocates an epistemology called proper functionalism. So for him, as long as your vision is functioning correctly, as long as it's divine to aim at the truth and there's nothing going wrong with it, then as long as your vision tells you the tree exists, you immediately have reason to think, hey, that's a hickory tree. Right? My landscaper has a justified, true belief that is a hickory tree. Well, the same thing happens with the stars. You look up, you see this thing, you immediately think, wow, God exists. That you're using your sensus divinitatus or your divine sense. And then you form belief that God exists. Now, almost all the various types of Reformed epistemology are doing some variation of what I just described here. So let me give one more example here. This is Chris Tucker's view of phenomenal conservatism, which I'm actually kind of a fan of. But his version of phenomenal conservatism is going to be reformed epistemology, where mine would not be. All right, so we're going to do a slight little detour here before we end up reaching belief in God or belief in the hickory tree, and that is based upon this concept of seemings. Right, so he just adds one little step here, and then it ends up being basically the same argument. Right, the arborist looks at the tree. It seems to him as if it's a hickory tree, and then he forms the belief it is in fact a hickory tree. Or you look at the stars, you get this overwhelming feeling. It certainly seems like God exists. So then you're rational for believing God does in fact exist, as long as you can't come up with some kind of counter argument to think that you're seeing something that's an illusion. So as long as you can't distrust your vision or distrust your sensus divinitatis, it's rational to believe that things are the way they seem until you come up with a reason to think otherwise. All right, so this is one of the ways you can argue that belief in God is properly basic. Now, as a side note, just because you're a phenomenal conservatist or a proper functionalist or any of these other philosophical positions does not require you to advocate Reformed epistemology. It's just possible to do both. I think the mistake happening here is that what's actually going on is a subconscious inference. You don't think you're making an inference, which is an evidence or argument to try and believe that the tree you see is a hickory tree. But the reason you know it's a hickory tree is because you learned it, because someone told you, or you used your past experiences to build up a collection of evidence to infer then that the tree you're seeing is hickory. So you might not be consciously aware that the hickory tree has 17 leaves per individual leaf, but that's actually how it works. That you knew that at some point. There's a lot of beliefs we have that we kind of forgot how it is we learn them, but we learn them via inference. Right? The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. I don't know who told me that, but I remember it from school somewhere, right? Or how do I know when Columbus sailed the ocean blue? No idea, but I know it, right? Some teacher told me, I just forgot where it is I gained that information. So I'm still making the inference. I'm still appealing to evidence. It's just happening on a subconscious level where I'm not fully aware of it. Well, I think the same thing is happening with our sensus divinitatis. It's not some sense that just pops God's existence into your brain. What's happening is that you recognize stars and you're like, that seems designed. It's so amazing. There must be a designer. Well, the idea that design implies a designer is the teleological argument. And whether you can consciously formulate it or not, it's totally irrelevant. The reason you believe God exists is not your sensus divinitatis. It's a subconscious inference to a teleological argument. It's an appeal to evidence. You just might not be able to actually say it out loud because you might not be super philosophically savvy. But all of those arguments end up being cosmological or teleological. Like, well, how did the universe begin? It must be God's existence, right? You're making a cosmological argument, not a very good version of it, but that's in its root. That's what it is. So it's these subconscious appealings to arguments. The sensus divinitatis is just another way of talking about evidence in a less conscious way. There's actually a lot of things people believe in the world rationally that are totally justified by overwhelming amounts of evidence, where if you put someone on the spot, they might actually fail to explain it. They might possess rational belief that their conclusion is true, but be unable to articulate it correctly. Like if you challenge someone to prove the world is round, it's pretty easy to do, but when you put someone on the spot like that, they might not be able to bring forth those reasons. Or if they do bring forth the reasons, they might mess it up a little bit. But that doesn't mean their belief is irrational. And ultimately, the reason you believe the world is round depends upon those evidence and arguments. I think that belief in God is very similar to belief that the world is round, in that both have overwhelming evidence in their favor. But the truth of those claims depends upon the evidence and is rationally believed depending upon those evidences, which is why it's important, as I say at the end of every video, to test everything and hold on to the good.